3 times, right? And his previous talks were good, but this one was, I think it was pretty awesome because of his life experience that came through and the spontaneous way he presented it. It just worked so well, didn't it? So let's have the first question to Peter. Yes.
Yeah, excellent presentation, Peter. I'll be brief. First of all, from a military point of view, I don't understand. 120 strong, Syrian army, just down tools, down weapons, just like that. Do you know if there's any evidence of them regrouping around the country to fight there? Because I mean, Israel had a lot of losses against the Free Syrian Army as well. So do you think there's evidence of them regrouping? Are the generals regrouping? That's my first question. Secondly, who do you think seeks to benefit long term from what's happened?
Well, in terms of regrouping, I think you can forget about it. There are pockets of resistance still, most obviously in the Alawite areas, also in the far south, in the mainly Druze areas, and
explain exactly what Alawite is.
The catalyst for conflict is the attempt of the jihadis to confiscate weapons. They're going through villages trying to confiscate weapons and often meeting resistance. But in terms of that resistance being very organized or united, at the moment it's all very inchoate. As I mentioned before, the HTS are thin on the ground, so they are finding it difficult when they meet resistance. But there is no polarizing figure. And Assad is gone, he's yesterday's man. There are no alternative leaders around whom at the moment resistance might crystallize, and I really don't see it happening for the foreseeable future. 5 years down the line, there may well be such figures emerging. In terms of winners and losers, well, superficially, Israel is the big winner, very obviously. They've had a key Arab player taken down. They've had a chance to obliterate the weapons of that country. Not that Syria ever actually was a threat to Israel. When you look at around Israel's borders, you see a pattern, and Israel grooms its neighbors into acting as its border guards. Egypt, obviously, for many, many years, guards the Sinai approaches. Jordan, obviously, guards the River Jordan border. Lebanon, Hezbollah, for 16 years after 2006, kept that Israeli-Lebanon border quiet. They got no thanks for it, but they did actually prevent Palestinian Fedayeen from lobbing Katyusha rockets across that border. Northern Galilee had never enjoyed a longer period of peace in its existence. Not that you'd guess, because Hezbollah has been demonized, but in fact it was Hezbollah who kept that border quiet, and Hezbollah who kept jihadis in Syria at bay while all the shenanigans were going on during the Syrian conflict. There were jihadi groups in Lebanon, but they were countered not by the Lebanese army or any other Lebanese militia, but by Hezbollah. Hezbollah kept Lebanon out of the hands of the jihadis. And there's a new focus of a developing problem now with the jihadis in Lebanon, helped from across the border in Syria. That's something to watch. But the Syrians kept that Golan border quiet for 50 years. They got no thanks for it, but that is the reality. I once asked the Syrian foreign minister when I was in Damascus. Why do you accept this situation? Why don't you make some noise about it? Why don't you question the presence of the UN border force, monitoring force? And the answer I got was, well, the Israelis would just bomb Damascus. Simple as that. We're not going to make waves. And so the Syrians were groomed by the Israelis to act as their border guards. And it was only in the last, well, since October 7, 2023, that Syria actually did anything concrete against Israel, and that was by facilitating weapons transfers to Hezbollah, which was fighting Israel. But Syria itself hasn't so much as broken an Israeli window in 50 years. So there's a thought. In terms of Israel is the big winner, but you know, these things take time to work through. You know, the famous story, someone asked the very wise Chinese foreign minister Chu Enlai, what's your assessment of the French Revolution? And he said, it's too early to say. It may be a bit like that.
Somebody asked about the Alawites.
Yes.
And Assad's family were Alawite, is that right?
Yes, the Alawites are a small sect. They mostly consider themselves to be Muslims, but other Muslim sects say they're not. In particular, Sunnis don't accept Alawites as fellow Muslims. Shia generally do accept the Alawites as Muslim cousins. They have some slightly strange beliefs, but then don't all the sects. I mean, we have people in this country who believe that you can wake up from the dead. So they all have these weird beliefs, and the Alawites and the Druze who believe in reincarnation, they also are a minority sect. The Alawites number perhaps about, well, it's been reckoned that they might be 10% of the population, so they're quite numerous, and they're concentrated along the Mediterranean coast. They dominate in areas like Latakia and Banias, Tartus, and that's where the main problems are at the moment.
I think we mustn't forget that the Mediterranean, of course, has got the Russian naval base.
Yes, it's no accident that the Russians put their base in Latakia, where the local population is generally sympathetic to the Assad government, and therefore the Russians. It still remains to be seen whether the Russians will actually leave those bases. There's an air base nearby as well as a naval base, and I suspect that the leader, formerly known as Mr. Golan, actually is trying to keep the Russians as a bargaining card in his forthcoming negotiations with the Americans over the lifting of sanctions. I think he would like to keep that card in his pocket, which is why he's not asking the Russians to leave. The Russians may decide for their own reasons to leave, and I personally think they'd be foolish to hang around in an unfriendly environment, and they can go to Libya instead, it seems. But that's something that's going on in the background.
On the Druze citizens of Israel serve in the IDF, and they're treated better than other Arab citizens, you could argue. Is there any sense that the Druze in the Golan might cooperate with the IDF and welcome living under an Israeli occupation rather than a al-Qaeda state?
The short answer is yes, and indeed some Druze villages have asked to do just that. To Syrian Druze villages right on the border of the buffer zone have asked the Israeli army to come and protect them against the jihadis, seeing them as the lesser evil, and seeing how their cousins, the Israeli Druze, are relatively well treated in Israel. They get welfare payments, for example, and are generally left alone. As you mentioned, they serve often as scouts in the IDF. But other Syrian Druze definitely do not want to be incorporated into Israel. They are resisting the Israeli patrols, or trying to, and Druze often occupied positions of power inside the Syrian armed forces, which is one reason why they're now being victimized by the jihadis.
Where does Jordan fit in with all this?
Jordan is a political eunuch. They signed away their birthright years ago, and they're simply a puppet of the Americans and the Israelis. The deal is that Jordan protects Israel against attacks from its territory by Palestinian militia. In return, the king gets to stay in power and gets intelligence support from Israel and the Americans, economic support, and is generally spoilt as a pet Western puppet.
Can I just, somebody asked a question about who was likely to benefit with Syria. What I'd like to do, I've got a transcript here. Now, this is a US general who's now retired, but he was not just any old general of the United States. He was what's called SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Okay? Now, this is a very, very well-known quote, but when I read this quote, it'll be very, very clear who benefits, because obviously Hubo knows who benefits. Right, here goes. We're going to take out 7 countries, that's the United States, okay? We're going to take out 7 countries in, he said 5 years, it's been longer than 5 years, 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria. And again, it's not in this order, but these are the countries they planned that they will take out, right? So with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. But in addition to that, there's Afghanistan, and of course there's a coup d'etat in Ukraine initiated by the US State Department. But very, very simply, you know, if you're aware of this, and if you've done your research analysis study, you'll be aware, going through all the paperwork and reports and all the rest of it, of who benefits. And it's very simply the United States.
No, it's not.
Yeah, well, the Israel as well. I mean, part and parcel.
The United States does not benefit at all from those wars. It's Israel that benefits.
Yeah. Well, they benefit as well.
Well, let's hand this over to our speaker.
Yes, so what you quoted is well documented, and other famous people have quoted from it, and it's beyond dispute that the Americans have been working to a long-term plan to take out any opposition and to, as I said earlier, complete the Meccano set of Arab countries, and now they've taken out the Syrian piece and may or may not move on to Iran. Whether they benefited can be discussed. Certainly American defense contractors have benefited enormously. and therefore to some extent the American economy, which is a war economy. America never has fewer than 4 or 5 wars going at any given time. And as Russia is also discovering, war economies can actually be quite successful, though there comes a limit. But anyway, I would say that Israel is the most obvious, most direct beneficiary. The Americans were only trying to help Israel by removing Saddam. They didn't care about human rights. They knew there were no weapons of mass destruction. It was all about Israel. And taking down Syria has also been all about Israel.
Is American hegemony going to plan?
Sorry, can we just... James had a question.
The man over there was basically talking about American hegemony. Is that going to plan? Does America rule the waves still, or is the ship sinking?
Well, it's meeting new and different waves now with the rise of the global south. China, Russia getting their act together along with the BRICS, the other developing countries, which are no longer willing to be pushed around in quite the same way by America. American sanctions applied to over 50 countries around the world have been a turn-off to many countries. The way the Americans have behaved over the genocide in Gaza has alienated many in the global south. So America has never been more reviled in the world generally, and despised for its double standards, for the way it's tossed international law into the bin. America's prestige has never been lower. But tactically, anyway, it looks at the moment as though they've had some modest success by taking down Syria. And now a new chapter is opening. A president who doesn't appear to believe in quite the same American empire that the globalists do, who believes in America first, believes in isolationism. And I would recall that America withdrew from the League of Nations, which was the predecessor to the United Nations. And I do have hopes that something similar may yet occur with NATO. And, certainly if Trump wanted to cause friction within NATO, he wouldn't be going about it any other way but than by claiming Danish territory, etc., etc. It's almost as though he wanted to provoke.
And also Canada. He wants to take control of Canada.
To be fair, James, next.
Well, thank you. An excellent speech. I learned a lot from it. There's one little detail which you're beginning to touch on now, which is the origins of the demise of Syria and particularly of Assad. There was a document produced by the Israeli Mossad officer Oded Yinon in Herzliya in 1980 called Clean Break, a New Strategy for Securing the Realm. And that was produced because the Israelis were getting a bit worried about wars with the Arab nations. Remember, 67, 73 and so on was beginning to cause them some trouble. So Oded Yinon came up with this plan that it would be much more efficient to infiltrate the troubling neighbours and bring down their dictators, in inverted commas, starting with Syria. He actually says in his document, which you can see even on Wikipedia, we're going to roll back Syria, and we're going to do it by infiltrating agents provocateurs into the country to stir up popular antagonism towards the leaders. And they've done it. They did it in Libya. They did it to some extent in Lebanon, but not so successfully. And now they're doing it, or have done it, to Syria. And they do this by an organisation which the gentleman who spoke earlier told me about, an organisation run by George Soros called there are two of them actually. The one's called the Association of Youth Movements, and the other's called a National Association for Democracy.
National Endowment.
Thank you, thank you. Oh, you know about it. Well, perhaps I'm talking to an audience that doesn't need to hear me speak, but they funded those terrorists, if you like, or rebels, if you prefer, to bring down the organisations that were running the country, with no particular plan to make it any better. So who's benefiting, as was asked? The Israelis. These countries have been turned into complete disaster areas with no regulation, no laws, no proper government, no experience of governing a country. And the Israelis are having a lovely time because they don't have any threat from them. Meanwhile, they've chosen to annihilate the people in their own country, the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, but now in the West Bank as well. One asked, some people have peculiar beliefs. Well, I think the people who have the most peculiar beliefs are those people who say or think that God chose them.
Well, there can't be much argument that Israeli plans are deep laid, and on the surface they appear to have carried them out thoroughly. But we have to note that the Israelis have struggled to overcome not 3 countries, but 3 militias: Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. They haven't even been fighting fully grown countries or proper armies. And they've been fighting these 3 militias and haven't actually defeated any of them. And we are seeing in Gaza the much predicted demise of Hamas doesn't appear to be happening. In all the blather about the terms of the ceasefire, there is one important fact which is ignored, that Hamas is still running Gaza. I mean, who's putting out the figures of the number of casualties? As the BBC constantly remind us, the Hamas-run Ministry of Health. They are the government. They're the government today, and they will be the government tomorrow, in an effective condominium with the United Nations, I believe. Nothing in the terms that have been made public of the ceasefire say a word about the removal of Hamas as the de facto government, as the legitimate elected government indeed of Gaza. And the fact that not a word is referred to, is laid down in any text about the governance of Gaza speaks volumes, because the reality is there. Hamas are still standing, and especially once the Israeli army has withdrawn, as it's mandated to do by the terms of the agreement, who else is going to remove Hamas? So, as I've been predicting from day one, Hamas would stay standing, and they will still be the government of Gaza.
Peter?
Yes, thanks for the talk. It's very good, Peter. Coming on to Hamas, why do you suppose that they vastly underestimate the number of casualties? Because even Lancet says they're way over what is actually reported. Why is it that Hamas have quoted? I mean, that's the first question. Simply because you brought that up. Another thing, coming back to Syria again, the thing I find so disconcerting is the fact that all the different people that were interviewed on different channels, like Judging Freedom with Judge Neil Baghdad, the experts there, they were all completely unpredicted. It came out of the blue as far as they were concerned. I don't know whether that was the same with you at all, but it seems to me that it happened just at the right time for Israel, from Israel's point of view, considering they were fighting with Lebanon at the time, and Hezbollah depended on the transfer through Syria. So it seems to me as if it came at a very, the most convenient time for the overthrow of Assad. I mean, do you suppose there's anything in that?
Well, to take the second question first, I think the Idlib jihadis, they decided the timing, and they moved, partly at least because Hezbollah had been badly weakened by what happened during the Gaza conflict and the way Israel beat up on Iran and Hezbollah. Hezbollah could have sent forces to the borders of Idlib and stopped it happening, but that was impossible. Hezbollah is licking its wounds in Lebanon. Anything else, I think, is theory. But I suspect the breakout could have happened at any time in the previous 12 months. I think the Syrian army was in no combat-ready state. The jihadis were. Maybe they were waiting for an opportune time in relation to Gaza. The historians, we'll have to wait for the historians on that. As regards the casualty figures, I think it's simply that the figures are counted by the Ministry of Health based on the number of bodies and wounded who are brought to the hospitals. But there are many other victims buried under rubble, or people who don't dare go, fighters, for example, go to the hospitals, which are themselves being attacked by the Israelis. I think that's the reason why the numbers are vastly underreported.
I'd like to know where the jihad organizations get their money from.
I simplify. Essentially, the Gulf, primarily Qatar, which has bottomless pockets with its gas, with its LNG. Qatar is one of the countries profiting from climate change and net zero, because we're importing a lot more LNG, along with LNG from, you've guessed it, America, another massive beneficiary of net zero. So essentially Qatar, but they're also being gifted vast amounts of equipment by the Turks. And the Americans, at one point during the conflict, they were passing hundreds of millions of dollars to the jihadis. That was what they called Operation Sycamore. But Trump put a stop to that. After that, American support was more like intelligence grooming operations, and the British have helped immensely with propaganda. But in terms of funding, Qatar, very simply.
Well, Qatar is supposed to be building a new gas pipeline straight through to Europe, and it needs Syria to get the gas pipeline through. So there's no other way to bring the gas through to Europe, so it can then cut the Russian supply off completely.
Well, I think LNG has completely altered the strategic picture.
It's so cheap to pipe it than it is to ship it there.
Oh, thank you. Assad, what kind of a person was he? All these stories about bodies being tortured in jails and so on, and also what do you think his future's going to be?
Assad was no Saddam. He wasn't a sadist or a psycho. He was a very urbane, London-trained ophthalmologist. That was his background. He wasn't groomed to be president. He only became president literally by accident after his brother wrapped himself around a tree in a sports car. So Assad hadn't been prepared for it, and he was not a military man. His manner, his staff revealingly behind his back called him the doctor, because he had a habit of lecturing people. That was his manner. I would take visitors from London to call on him, and he'd give us a history lecture. This was the doctor. But a torturer, a sadist, no, not really. And all the demonization going on with regard to him and his poor wife who's sick is disgusting. I won't say it's pointless, because it has a purpose to distract from the atrocities that are going on today with Western support and connivance. The real atrocities that are happening to the Alawites and others, that is the purpose of it. That's why we're hearing this Assad porn. Assad maybe had flawed judgment. He came across as being perhaps overconfident, and maybe he was complacent towards the end. But he saw himself as a modernizer. This is 20 years ago, he created something called the IT Society in Damascus. A lot of reformists and proto-democrats were members of it. But it all got knocked sideways by the Iraq conflict.
I mean, he created a society in which Jews, Muslims and Christians could coexist, a secular government. And that has now gone forever, hasn't it?
Well, nothing is forever. I find it hard to believe that Syria will not one day go back to being its cosmopolitan, secular self, and that it will evolve, even under jihadi management. We're seeing in the Gulf how even a conservative, fundamentalist regime like Saudi Arabia is moving over the long term. Maybe that will happen, or maybe Syria will become more like a Sunni Lebanon, which is very open.
How long were you in Syria for? What years?
I lived there only for 3 years, but I constantly visited Syria before and after. I must have been there about 20 times.
So what period, what time frame?
I was living there 2003 to 2006. And my last visit there was in 2014.
I used to work in Aleppo.
Have you any idea what he's doing in Russia now? Through the back channels at all? Do you hear any contact at all?
Any what, sorry?
Contact at all? I mean, have you any idea how he's occupying himself in Russia?
No, not really.
Stroke last month.
Oh, right.
but Assad is yesterday's man.
Oh yes, I realise that. I just wondered whether he decided to go back to ophthalmology.
There's no way.
He's got to earn his living now.
On Trump, I was wondering, I appreciate your ability to sit comfortably with the ambiguity and the contradictions and the dissonance that nobody really knows what's going to happen. But what do you make of Jared Kushner and his influence on Trump as far as the Middle East is concerned? And also, I suppose the alt media sphere has a lot of emotion and fervor, and I appreciate that serves a purpose. And there's an eagerness to downplay all of the triumphs of Israel and stuff like that. But if one considers oneself, an objective observer that tries to describe things as they objectively are, first and foremost, and then an activist after that, some people find it hard to deny and continue to downplay the triumphs of Israel in the region in the last several months. And a lot of people were predicting all throughout last year that Israel was going to completely implode within a couple of years and so on. And when they killed Nasrallah, everyone was saying, oh, well, it's spectacular optics, but Hezbollah is still very strong. Craig in Beirut now is a lot more pessimistic, and you have to give credit where it's due that you might not, none of us might not like it, but are the Jews basically here to stay now? And is it a new order in the Middle East that's a lot darker for, the foreseeable future? What are your views of that?
Well, that's a big question. Is there a new order in the Middle East in the making? Maybe there is, but I suspect it will look very much like the old order. And I see the limitations of what the Israelis have managed to achieve in terms of their objectives. Looking forward, there will still be big issues over Gaza, in particular over governance. As I was saying earlier, Hamas are going to stay in governance. That's not going to please Israel or the West, and there's going to be a big hoo-ha over reconstruction. It's not going to happen, possibly. We may see sanctions on Gaza, something stupid like that. Maybe they'll be given the Syria treatment. But as we've seen over the last 18 months, the Gazans are incredibly resilient, and compared with what they've endured, harsh sanctions, which they were already experiencing before, will seem like relative relief. Nothing has basically changed in Lebanon. Hezbollah is still a very powerful force there. I think the new order will look very much like the old order, to be brief.
And then Jared Kushner.
Down to America, the hegemony of America you spoke about earlier. The question I've got to ask is, I've heard the word bandied about that America is the useful idiot, because the people who actually are the CEOs of the corporations, like Boeing, Winthrop, and all the others, they are actually of Israeli background or Jewish background. So the question over there still falls back in, even if you go into the COVID side of things, you back into the CEOs who are running the corporations. So whoever's running the corporation, America's just a whipping boy. So it's just a useful idiot to achieve an end. But it's no different to the British Empire or the British people. The British people weren't weren't actually reflected by the British Empire. The British Empire is a corporate state. And the corporate state is the governing that overruns the whole lot. So when you're talking about Israel, you're talking about the governing body. So if you turn around and you say Israel has nothing to do with it, or Israel is short of responsibility in these areas, I think that would be a little bit negligent to say. So where do you think Israel stands with regard to America? Look, what was done in the Middle East was trained and practiced in Africa, in South America, in Asia. These were the training grounds to fine-tune the plan to how to operate in the Middle East. Once they'd fine-tuned it, they moved to the Middle East.
I'm more of a believer in state theory. I think the actions of states are governed more by ideology and nationalism than by economic interest or by the actions of corporations. I think we underestimate the power of ideas at our peril. After all, the huge cataclysmic events that have happened over the last 100 years have all been down to ideas. Communism, Nazism, liberalism. It's ideology that makes the weather, as it were, and climatism is the latest one, not to mention religion. So you can build theories about corporate interests, and they're not mutually exclusive. They can both be running on parallel lines, but it always comes down to ideas, I think.
I feel like the West is in a rush, and the East is just taking its time now. And the West has no comprehensive philosophy, and the East is experienced and playing the long game.
Well, the one to watch is obviously China. Now America's freaking out over its big Asian adversary, as it calls it. They're not used to being challenged. Although I do remember that when I briefly lived in America, it was the time when they were freaking out over Japan. And books were coming out with titles like Japan #1. Whatever happened to Japan? And I suspect that the same thing will happen to China. I mean, we've not got time to go into this, but my Chinese friends tell me that the Americanization of China is proceeding apace, and that the aspiration of nearly every middle-class Chinese family is to send their offspring to California. So the revolution is happening from the inside. Now there's a thought on which I think we might...
Well, can I just put a question? Just about Christians in...
Speak up.
About Christians in Syria. I think that is the country where the word Christian was first used, and they were using. There were communities speaking Aramaic, the language that Jesus used, and the word Christian was first used in Syria. Would you like to comment on the persecution of Christians going on there?
It's a fact, yes. Christians in Syria are afraid, very afraid. They've seen jihadi gangs, often on motorbikes, parading through even prosperous Christian areas of Damascus and Latakia. So far, there haven't been as many violent incidents as there have been with the Alawites. But nevertheless, the Christians are being pushed around. Their houses and lands are being stolen. This has happened in particular in the village of Ma'lula, the historic village where Aramaic is still a common language. And I think I mentioned some members of the House of Lords and other prominent clerics have been making a bit of a noise about that, but they need to make more. And this is in a way, the Achilles heel of the jihadis, that they really need to exercise more discipline, otherwise it's only a matter of time before the Western media catch up and the Western churches get organized. In the meanwhile, I have to say the Christians of Syria are being let down by their clerical leadership, who have gone along with the jihadi masters, posing in photographs, making statements to the effect that the new rulers have to be accommodated and that everybody can look forward to them being moderate and treating the Christians well. This is not what their flocks are feeling. And in fact, some of these statements by Syrian Christian clerics come across as hostage statements. But some of them are, I'm afraid, typical church leaderships appeasing, just as in Nazi Germany, Christian leaders appeased Hitler. We're seeing the same thing in Syria today.
On the subject of Israel, there's no doubt Israel was having problems up until the downfall of Syria, and I'll tell you why. I was in Brooklyn in May, and I was speaking to what they call themselves Brooklyn Jews. Some of them came from northern Israel, and they said they had no intention of going back to northern Israel because it was just far too dangerous. Some of them also came from the southern port of Eilat. They had business, and they said the Israeli tourist industry lost thousands of dollars, millions of dollars over what's happening. So they had no intention of going back. But whether this may change things now that Syria's, if Hezbollah hasn't got the stronghold anymore, that link, it could change things maybe. Maybe they're thinking now, as Napoleon said in his Thoughts of Art and War, you can never predict the outcome of a war because you don't know what the other side's doing. It's far too complex, I think.
I suspect that with time they will trickle back. People don't leave their homes long term without very, very strong reasons. And as I mentioned before, Hezbollah took care of that border for 16 years. And I think we're now going back to that situation. I think Hezbollah were mistaken to launch attacks on Israel. That's in support of Gaza. That's easy to say now with hindsight. At the time, I wasn't sorry to see Hezbollah act. Let me put it that way. But with hindsight, it was obviously a dreadful, cataclysmic mistake. And they got no thanks for it from Palestinians. This is the dreadful thing. The Palestinians, being overwhelmingly Sunni, many of them have applauded the advent of the jihadi regime in Syria. Hamas itself is very close to Qatar. Hamas itself left Syria in the lurch in the early days of the conflict, even though Syria had been their only Arab supporter. But when they saw the jihadis making progress in the early days of the Syrian conflict, Hamas left Damascus by choice and went over to the other side. And they've also in the past been very close to Turkey. And even in Gaza, there were celebrations at the fall of Assad. I, for one, will not blame Hezbollah if they now wash their hands completely of the Palestinians. And I would not be shocked if the Iranians didn't do a rethink as well and get a life instead. But having said that, I have to do justice to the many Palestinians of Syria who did stay loyal, and there were key regiments, units in the Syrian army who were among the best and bravest fighters during the long years of conflict. But we can't ignore the fact that many, even in Gaza, saw the Syria conflict in religious terms, and they were motivated more by Sunni solidarity, because the Syrian conflict was, in one way, a war of Sunni supremacy. It was many things, a war for Israeli and American supremacy, but it was also internally a war for Sunni supremacy. Get rid of the secular regime, get rid of the Alawites and the Christians, put the Sunni majority in control and establish a Sunni fundamentalist regime. So this will have shaken things up among the Shia of the region, I think. The repercussions may take a while to work themselves out.
Okay, well, thank you, Peter. I think it's time to relieve Peter and give him some peace and quiet. Peter, when you sort out the Turkish issue, come back and give us another talk, because I'm puzzled about that too. It's gratifying to know that we're both puzzled.